Hello and welcome to Chapter 9, Other Considerations when Working with AI Technology. We're going to start by looking at using AI responsibly. And then we're going to take some time to get into data privacy and security considerations. We're going to talk about why it's important to use AI to supplement analytical thinking, but absolutely not replacing it. And then we're going to close out this chapter by looking at what the future holds, both in terms of what's happening now and the next 12 to 24 months, and then a few predictions for what we might see further out into the future. Now, this is not about AI taking over the world. I mean, you could argue it already has, but instead think about in earlier chapters when we were looking at what AI can actually do today. And this section is going to clarify what AI shouldn't be doing, at least not in a vacuum. AI is really that decision support tool. It is not the decision owner. AI can do some great things. It can summarize data, it can draft outputs for us, it can model scenarios, but accountability for those outputs never shifts from finance and treasury. In fact, thinking about, the human in the loop approach, it's really non-negotiable for those teams. And for me, it's, the equivalent to needing a human to physically review controls in our close processes and cash management. We would not want AI technology performing those reviews for us. There still needs to be that human element for the judgment aspect. AI is riddled with bias. It can lead to hallucinations, and gaps when it comes to context still exist today. As we're working with outputs generated from AI, we should be treating it like the first draft from a junior analyst on our team, or if we're looking at a spreadsheet that has been built by someone else and we're looking at it for the first time. And where there is data, there is the potential for data-driven bias. Think about, data that is trained on historical transactions, past, payment behaviors and forecasts. If that data doesn't reflect, our past constraints or perhaps conservative policies that were in place at that time, AI, can reinforce that kind of thinking and that behavior as we think about the future. And it can lead to, overly pessimistic cash flow forecasts or, biased credit risk assessments for our customers, for example. So it requires, it just requires that human level of judgment and not just relying solely on the outputs from AI. And as I already mentioned, we are accountable for the outputs. The model is not. As we discussed earlier in this course, we'll leverage prompt engineering for better inputs and reduce the risk of bias and hallucinations in our outputs. And even with agentic AI, it's still important to build in the appropriate checks and balances and approvals into the workflows that we leverage with those agents. I want to touch on a quote here from Mira Murati. Mira is, if you don't know Mira, she is the former CTO of OpenAI. And I quote here, AI is a really incredible and magical technology, but the breadth, the reach, the consequence is also great. There's always risk that comes with that, and you manage that risk with responsibility. And I think, Mira is just spot on here with this assessment. Without the appropriate guardrails in place, as end users of AI technology, we run the risk of doing more harm than good if we are not using it responsibly. At the end of the day, there's a reason that we have data privacy and security in place. And it's paramount. And when we think about data privacy and security, within finance and treasury teams, we are often dealing with highly sensitive data. Not all finance data belongs in an AI prompt. as we think about the data that finance and treasury teams have, it's really the crown jewels for an organization. It's your bank accounts, your forecasts, payroll. As we think about potential M&A activity, where the exposure is potentially existential, not just theoretical, behind the scenes. It's very much data that we're using to drive the business. So the real question that we should be thinking about here is, it's not that is AI secure? The question we should be asking ourselves is which AI should we be leveraging, for which data, and for which decisions that we want to make. Treat data eligibility as a decision, not as a user judgment to be made just kind of for each use case on the fly. We want to provide that clarity in advance. When it comes to data storage and processing, the storage of data, the training of the model against that data, and the reuse of that data matters. There's a material difference when you think about, analyzing data that's anonymized versus aggregated inputs, as you think about like variance drivers in analysis, compared to, just raw data that we're getting from bank statements or payment files. And if we're using, a public LLM, it may log, retain, or even train on the prompts that we are putting into that tool. And it can create, exposure that finance teams don't control and they may not even be aware of. So what's absolutely critical here is that when you're working with your LLM of choice, that you're establishing enterprise-wide AI agreements that should be explicitly calling out to not train on your data, to have clear retention limits, and defined processing locations for that data. Finance and Treasury should insist that this is documented within those agreements. And frankly, it's pretty commonplace today as companies are working with vendors that manage these large LLM solutions. One way to think about the data, we were just talking about highly sensitive data. At the end of the day, different data requires different guardrails. And one approach that you can take is establishing clear data tiers, or a tiered approach. And the way I think about it is you can really establish a free tiered system to set expectations in advance. Like the first tier of your data could be, public data that's available, or just generic finance knowledge. Well, that's safe and can be used freely within any LLM. There's really little to no risk. As you bring it down to tier 2, we're looking at internal data, but perhaps it's summarized or anonymized in some way. We still need to be careful as we're leveraging that data, but it's not as risky because it's summarized or anonymized at the end of the day. And then we get into the bottom tier, which is going to be that highly sensitive data. It's going to be looking at cash positions in our bank accounts. It's going to be looking at, payroll data, payroll that's supporting M&A activity. And that data should only be used within very, specific restricted tools within an organization where we are confident that our agreements in place ensure that there's no training against that data, that there's clear retention limits in place, etc. And having just this simple tiered approach, really enables adoption of the technology. It allows teams to move quickly by understanding, what that lowest common denominator policy is that is going to impact the data that we use with AI technology. And I'll just bring it back to a quick analogy here that certainly helps me think about this. As we think about just being out on the road, we don't drive on every road at the same speed limit, right? We have freeways, but then we have school zones. They exist for a reason. Like sometimes we need to slow down and think about, where we're driving in certain locations and the need to be extra sensitive, in this case, to the speed that we're driving, within that area. So we can think of those school zones as where we're leveraging highly sensitive data. We need to slow down and really think about what we're doing there before we drive through. And then just taking a step back, ultimately, we should be working with AI under the same kind of framework as any other technology when it comes to security controls. So we should be aligning those controls really across the board. So a great starting point for AI is to inherit, the same expectations for our ERP, treasury management system, data warehouse, all of those other key applications that we use in finance and treasury, and implement the same controls as we think about access controls, the need for auditability, approval workflows, and monitoring. All of those things apply to AI technology as well. And at the end of the day, if AI can influence our forecasts, if it can influence our decisions around liquidity decisions or payments that we're making, it really falls in the bracket of SOX, internal controls, and risk management. So it's important that we think about this AI technology just as we would managing our ERP or TMS. Now, the goal here is not to create a bunch of new governing rules. It's about consistent application of the existing security and governance that we already have in place. So make sure you're keeping that top of mind and make sure you have those security controls in place across all of these applications. Now, ultimately, AI risk in finance isn't about, trying to ban or prohibit tools. It's about designing them intentionally. If you can classify data in advance, and we just talked about having that tiered approach and align that with existing controls that you have in place, your teams are going to be able to move forwards quickly and ultimately safely. Now we're going to move into, the importance of leveraging AI to supplement our way of thinking, but certainly not replace it. And it's important that we have the right security protocols in place so that AI does not replace our ability to think, but truly augments it. So as we think about acceleration, AI is going to, accelerate analysis that we perform, but it doesn't necessarily validate it. Speed, our goal of speed here is not the same as correctness. AI, is fantastic when it comes to pattern recognition, drafting narratives, and, just exploring what-if scenarios. It can produce outputs very quickly, even against large financial data sets. But what it can't do is determine whether, an insight is material to our business or appropriate or decision worthy for us. It doesn't have that context. Faster analysis increases the need for validation, not the opposite, especially in business critical functions like forecasting, thinking about liquidity, or risk-based decisions. As we've said throughout this entire course, context still wins when it comes to making finance decisions. If AI doesn't know what matters, how can it produce the right decisions? And that's where the human in the loop, our teams, are still absolutely necessary. AI really struggles with one-off events from just a contextual standpoint as we think about, regulatory nuances, decisions that have been made, kind of top-down executive decisions within our organization, or even just strategic exceptions that ultimately drive, the decisions that we're making. If AI doesn't have that context, how can it apply that judgment to the outcomes that it's proposing? It lacks just, we talk about team members having institutional knowledge. AI doesn't have that. It doesn't have, any kind of the political context within our organization. And it doesn't understand why prior decisions were made. Why is the process the way that it is today? And ultimately, as we think about the judgment that we need to make around materiality, trade-offs, and the level of risk that we're willing to adopt, AI can certainly help with some of the thinking behind that, but the accountability and the decision making sits with our team, not with the model. And if we start leaning on the model to make these decisions, we start to run the real risk that we are outsourcing our thinking to AI instead of truly augmenting it. And if we start making bad assumptions by leaning on decisions made by AI, those bad decisions scale very quickly. Without that level of just healthy skepticism, AI outputs are going to create a false sense of confidence and push teams to expect answers that, we didn't truly spend the time to investigate. And those weak processes that we establish through leaning on AI don't improve. And in fact, they become, rapidly worse as a result, because AI is going to lean on its own past analysis that we have accepted as truth. And over-reliance on those outcomes from our teams ultimately turns those analytical owners, people that were managing that critical thinking in the past, into just passive reviewers. And it just increases risk into the model and ultimately makes those decisions less meaningful and just fragile and risky to the business. Now, what we're going to see is that AI separates strong analysts from the weak ones. AI is going to help us sharpen our analytical skills. It is not a substitute for it. So stronger finance professionals are going to use AI to help them ask better questions, to help them challenge assumptions, to help them explore edge cases more efficiently. Weaker analysts are going to use AI to replace their reasoning, not enhance it. It's going to expose gaps in their understanding and ultimately their judgment. And over time, AI is going to raise the bar on performance. There's going to be a higher expectation from finance and treasury professionals. And those that, come with clarity of thought and continue to push the boundaries of AI are going to be rewarded for it. And those that just lean on the outputs from AI are going to be, punished in the long run. So just to recap this section, AI should really be thought of as a force multiplier when it comes to making critical financial decisions. And it's absolutely not a replacement for our thinking. To bring it back to an analogy real quick, just to kind of help us think about this more practically. Remember to think about AI as our own personal GPS. It helps us navigate much faster, but it's not going to tell us why a road is closed or why the destination that we're driving towards still makes sense for us. That's where the human element, the human critical thinking comes in and doesn't disappear. So now let's talk about what the future holds in the realms of AI technology within finance and treasury. I think in the next 12 to 24 months, most finance teams are going to see, AI agents becoming more prevalent and performing reconciliations of accounts, performing, anomaly detection, drafting, explanations for variance analysis, and even doing an excellent job preparing the first draft of a forecast. And we're going to see teams approving outputs and then investigating those exceptions, and then taking the time to tell the story and explaining those results to their stakeholders. We're going to see less time actually just spent producing the raw numbers and more time spent digging in, validating those numbers, interpreting them, and then communicating them to those that need to understand the story. As we think about kind of the past and the old model, we've really kind of just, we drove this manually. Under this new model, we're able to set our destination and then monitor the drive and intervene when we need to. The driver here, us, our role didn't disappear, but now by leveraging AI, we've gained that leverage to provide, more valuable output because we're not spending hours and hours producing the numbers. We're using that time for critical thinking to tell our story. I think we're going to see execution skills decline, but that's going to be counterbalanced with an increase in the need for judgment skills. As orchestration becomes the norm, the most valuable finance skills are going to shift. We're going to need to review AI outputs with skepticism and applying business context. We're going to investigate exceptions instead of manually processing the happy path. We just touched on storytelling, but the ability to explain the why behind the numbers and why they've changed, not just what changed. This is not going to be less work for us. I want to make that very clear. This doesn't mean that we can now all move to a 2-day work week. It just means that we're doing a higher order level of work than we've done in the past. AI technology is going to enable us to spend more time critical thinking than preparing raw data. Now, in the long term, I have a few, what I would call, bolder predictions that I want to share. My gut tells me this is the direction that we're moving in as we think kind of 3, 4, 5 years down the road. I think finance becomes, the operating system for business decisions. We're not just the scorekeeper anymore. I think monthly close is going to shrink dramatically. This idea of a 0-day close may, be more of a reality. And that's not because, suddenly all of the accounting rules are going to disappear, but because we as finance and treasury teams, we're going to be focused on managing the exceptions and managing them in real time. The best finance teams are going to manage portfolios of agents, just the way that managers manage their teams today, like a team of analysts. In the future, might be a portfolio of agents that's managed by one of the leaders. Even job titles, I think there's going to be a shift in the future. Today we have, senior accountant is a very common title in the finance space. I think in the future we might see those titles, those positions shift into finance systems leads or exception managers or decision architects, especially kind of building on my previous point around managing a portfolio of AI agents. I think we're going to see that adoption speed beats model sophistication. What I mean by that is the risk here isn't that AI is going to start replacing finance teams, but what's going to happen is that other finance teams are going to, win by adopting AI faster. And we talked earlier about early experimentation. Early experimenters are going to build better intuition in terms of where AI can help their organization versus hurting it. They're going to understand better governance practices for experience that are tried and tested. And they're going to ultimately have better outcomes because they're going to have their humans still in the loop working directly with the AI technology. I think we would all agree it's just a very, very exciting time to work in finance and treasury right now. And just as a final takeaway for all of you, just remember that AI is intended to be a multiplier. It's not a shortcut for any of us. We should use it responsibly, securely, and continue to use it with human judgment. When it comes to experimentation, let's start small and learn fast and have that be, a competitive advantage for our teams moving into the future. Wow, so we've covered a lot in this chapter as we think about, just those other considerations when working with AI technology. We looked at the importance of, working with AI responsibly and the need for human judgment. We looked at the criticality of data privacy and security practices, and also explored taking a tiered approach to the data that we use when working with AI technology so that we can support fast user adoption with a very simple framework. After that, we turned our attention to leveraging AI as a force multiplier for our analytical thinking and not as a replacement of it. And then we started to think about what does the future hold for finance technology and AI. And I also explored, some bolder predictions that I have for the future as well. And as I said, who knows, maybe that idea of a 0-day close is, much closer than we think, just with the advancement of AI technology that's happening today. Now, in the next chapter, it's really our last chapter in this course. So what we're going to do is a recap of each chapter in the course, from chapter 2 through to chapter 9, and we're going to tie the learnings from those chapters back to the objectives that we set out to achieve all the way back in chapter 1. So I'm really excited to kind of tie all of that together for you before we close out this course. So congratulations, you have successfully completed chapter 9. Thank you for joining me. I will see you all in our next and final chapter. Thank you very much.